Great. I think we can probably get started and then people might trickle in as time goes on. My name is Abby. I am the Transportation Policy Analyst for the Boston Region MPO. You were in a meeting of the Transit Working Group. If you intended to be in a different meeting, speak now. And so to start things off, I'll read our notice of non-discrimination. You are invited to participate in our transportation planning process, regardless of your race, color, national origin, including limited English proficiency, religion, creed, gender, ancestry, ethnicity, disability, age, sex, sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, veteran status, and background. Next slide. Our accessibility statement is that this meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1, Level AA standards, and revised Section 508 standards. If you require any additional accommodations in order to participate fully in the meeting, or if you have any technical difficulties, please contact Lauren McGee, MPO staff, at lmagee@ctps.org or 857-702-3706 or via the chat box. And lastly, our guidelines. So all participants will join the meeting with muted microphones. Please rename yourself to include your first name, your last name, and your affiliation. To participate in the discussion, please select the raise hand function. You can find this either clicking on the participants button at the bottom of the screen and a window will pop up with a raise hand button at the bottom, or the reactions toolbar button in the toolbar. And if you're on the phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand. Alrighty, so like I said, my name is Abby. I am a transportation policy analyst with the Boston Region MPO. I also help facilitate our transit working group. There are actually a fair amount of people whose name I do not recognize. So if you could put your name and your affiliation in the chat, just so we kind of have an understanding of who's here and who we're talking with, that would be great. And from there, I think we can just move right into the presentation portion of this. So the presentation today will be from Lucas Munson, who is a senior research analyst at Boston Indicators. Recently, Boston Indicators put out a report co-authored with Transit Matters that's about transit supportive density in Greater Boston. This is obviously relevant to all of the transit providers in the region, especially with the upcoming density changes that have either been adopted at town meetings or city councils and the ones that will be adopted at town meeting and city councils in the coming years. We are, of course, expecting more density in the Boston region. So this is relevant now and will remain relevant, and I'm looking forward to our discussion about it. And with that, I will pass it to Lucas.
Yeah, hello, can you guys hear me? Audio's good. All right, yeah. Thanks, Abby. Thanks for having me on. Hi, everybody. Nice to see you all. My name is Lucas Munson. I'm a senior research analyst on the Boston Indicators team here at we're a research group housed within the Boston Foundation. We've tackled a bunch of issues, and we've been kind of recently delving our feet more into the broader housing conversation. And then, of course, that kind of naturally segues into some transit-related stuff. So I'm really excited to present to you all today. I'll do a fairly short presentation. I'll try to keep it short, but some of the kind of broader takeaways of this report that we released last month with the folks at Transit Matters. I'll talk a little bit of context about the report as well, too, I guess, before jumping in. We're really excited to partner with Transit Matters on this because we're not really, transit experts in any by any stretch. But it was really nice to work with them and kind of think a bit about I guess the overall thought behind doing this report was that we felt like the conversations around housing and transit and TOD and 15-minute cities and all these things had made a lot of progress in recent years in the Boston area. But we felt like it kind of reached a moment where it got a little stuck in some ways. I think because of all the nitty-gritty conversations around MBTA communities and compliance and this and that, and we got very deep into the weeds with a bunch of the stuff, and we felt like it was a good time maybe to step back and remember what kind of looking at our system at a system-wide level and remembering what is possible, and introducing some other comparison examples from other regions to kind of reorient ourselves and kind of what Greater Boston is doing versus what other places are doing and what is possible here. And so we Boston Indicators provide a lot of the data analysis of that work, and Transit Matters did a lot of the kind of the regional comparisons and looking at specific case studies in areas in Boston, as well as kind of tying in the transit supportive side of things. So I want to keep the presentation fairly brief as well, because there's a lot of this report was kind of done with the interest of making these things digestible for a broader audience. And so it's not the wonkiest report up front, but so I think what it can do though is kind of be a good launching pad for some interesting conversations. And so hopefully we get a chance to have a little bit of that here, because it looks like there's a lot of folks in the room with a lot of expertise. And so I'm not going to pretend to be the transit expert, but I'll try to keep to some of the findings. So I'll share my screen. Let's see if I do this. Are you guys seeing the presentation now? Yes?
Yes, or at least I am.
Sure.
I hope everyone else is.
Okay. So if you are there, everyone is. All right. Yeah, so I mean, I guess I'll just jump right in. But obviously our report called Transport Density in Greater Boston. In the report, we'll just kind of walk through here. I'll do a little bit of the high level regional comparisons. Of course, all the stuff you can go into more depth with on the report that's available online that I think we'll be able to provide you guys the link. And then we'll kind of jump into research benchmarks that we use for trying to measure transport density. So a lot of this is trying to add a quantitative component to this work. We lean very heavily on Massachusetts Housing Partnership, Center for Housing Data's Residensity and Todex tools. In full disclosure, I used to work there and was kind of on the team that built Todex, and so a lot of this was kind of resurfacing some of that work as well. Then I'll talk a little bit about the state of transport density in Greater Boston. So looking at those metrics along different lines of the system, comparing the commuter rail, as well as highlighting specific areas. And then I'll just kind of flag a little bit about so a few specific case studies areas that we thought were interesting or worth drawing a little bit more attention to. Yeah, and I'll try to have some room for some kind of Q&A or just kind of general conversation, honestly, with everybody who's, thank you for taking the time to be here. So regional comparisons. So for this component of the report, we just wanted to find, because obviously, like, I don't know, when you're talking about like density levels and, what's ideal, I think, people's heads maybe go to like East Asian cities or Western European cities or things like that, and kind of like, oh, that's the model that we should aspire to. And, it's kind of in the urbanist space or something like that. Those are kind of the things that we look towards. And we don't really feel like, that's always super relevant or super useful for our context here, in Greater Boston and, the United States. So instead, in the report, we chose 4 North American cities, Toronto, Vancouver, kind of the New Jersey, northern New Jersey, I guess, suburban New York context, as well as kind of Washington, D.C. and Northern Virginia. And this was kind of, Jared Johnson, the former executive director at Transit Matters, and Luke Schuster, our executive directors here at Boston Indicators, when they were kind of discussing the idea of this project, this was sort of the picture that got the wheels churning, and that, like, Toronto's obviously grown a lot in recent decades. It's a different metro area than Boston, but the patterns at which it's grown and kind of the land use development there has a lot to teach us. And all these cities, all these examples struggle with many of the same things we struggle with around kind of NIMBYism, around hesitancy to growth, around preserving neighborhood character, and all these struggles that most cities deal with on a day-to-day basis. But what's interesting is that then you can have these specific areas, especially along transit lines, where the mentality can be completely different. And so kind of looking at what's creating those different mentalities, how is that growth happening? And so kind of Toronto is one of those examples that really stood out to us. And at the same time, where Toronto's been able to develop these specific corridors, they've also done it in a lot of coordination with transit expansion, which wasn't really the framing that we were using so much in Greater Boston. Obviously, there are things like South Coast Rail, and there are new things coming online in Greater Boston. But Toronto has been able to do it while still has been able to kind of really master this relationship between transport density in a way that we haven't here. And this is a little bit more Transit Matters areas of expertise than mine personally, so I could only kind of raise the conversation a little bit. But Toronto's also done a really good job with their regional rail and kind of electrifying their RER system in a way that obviously is I mean, I think people here will know more about that than I do. But then as a result, Toronto's rapid transit ridership per mile is nearly 4 times greater than the MBTA's. And the commuter rail ridership is also about 2.5 times the ridership of the MBTA's. Well, I realize I should have a watch in front of me so I don't ramble forever. And so just, in the context of Boston, Boston is not the worst example in North America that one can find. However, it still has a ways to go. Another case study that we looked at more closely in the report is the Roslyn-Ballston corridor in Northern Virginia, outside of DC. There was a few reasons why we thought this was interesting, and one of it's kind of it's more just like a planning theory question where they used this back in the 1960s when this area was very underdeveloped. In the picture at the top left, that looks like a lot of areas in kind of suburban and inner core Boston even. They had this kind of bullseye approach to their rapid transit and regional rail expansion, where the zoning efforts near these new stations as they're being expanded were much more ambitious and much more targeted around the station area specifically. And so it's just like a really highly regarded model of TOD development. But what we thought was kind of interesting was then that what the groundwork that was laid 50 years ago really bears fruit today, and how highly developed and the density levels along the corridor specifically. Obviously, Northern Virginia still has its challenges with kind of densifying in a lot of ways, but we just thought it was a very interesting example and something that where, if you lay the groundwork now, future generations can really reap the benefits. And here's just like another depiction of that where, they still wrestle with a lot of questions around neighborhood character and whatnot, but they've been able to kind of really embrace higher density levels especially for commercial corridors in a way that we don't have very many good examples of in our region. And again, the output of that is higher levels of ridership. We also look at Vancouver a little bit. Obviously, Vancouver's get to a point where these examples start to get very different. Vancouver's has kind of a different historical context, but very incredible high levels of density, especially along their SkyTrain lines. I mean, it gets a little repetitive, so I'll go kind of quickly, but you can, I mean, just they have a kind of a different mode of development along, especially their SkyTrain line specifically, and have been able to achieve much higher levels of density than we have in Greater Boston. And you can draw connections to that, and the cost of renting a small studio apartment or something like that. Even though Vancouver is incredibly expensive, there are moments in which it's better. And then just kind of in a similar vein to Toronto, you have this. They're not really stopping there. They do continue to kind of when they open new lines, they pair that with really excellent zoning policies in a way that obviously in Greater Boston has been very difficult. And the last example that we talk about in the report is Northern New Jersey. And we try to do that for two reasons. One is the path line in Northern New Jersey, and like kind of in Jersey City, and it has for the more ambitious versions of kind of transportive density, but then also more of the suburban corridors in Northern New Jersey as well. And New Jersey's had a really excellent TOD initiative, it's called Transit Village Initiative, that's been able to produce fairly good levels of density. And while it's had its challenges and been very incremental, we talk about that a bit more in the report. But I'll move on to the hopefully those are a few interesting examples for people. I'll kind of move on to the more my area of expertise, which is kind of just cutting through the data here a little bit. So I'll give some numbers that hopefully will be interesting to people. Okay, this is a little bit of the behind the scenes of this stuff, but obviously when you're trying to like measure density and transit supportive density, there's sort of a lot going on there. You can look at the population density, you can look at housing unit density, you can look at a bunch of types of, there's a bunch of different ways you can cut this. You can look at it at the parcel level, the square mile level, the 10-minute walk shed level. It all produces different outcomes, which can kind of change the equations. As well as when you're looking at, what are you talking about transit supportive? Why isn't it just like transit oriented development? And when we're in kind of the research component of this, we were coming across that issue a lot where like you could talk about transit supportive density as in like what are the levels of density needed to support the expansion of transit service or to justify like the financing of your current transit system, or just to help increase ridership by X amount. But if it's heavy rail versus bus, that kind of changes the equation a bit. And so in the report, we were kind of wrestling with what different metrics have researchers tended to settle on. And obviously every researcher's methodology is different. There's a lot of factors that go into, what produces ridership. It's not, if only these things were so simple, I think all of our lives would be easier. But in general, we were like, okay, we're seeing kind of two consistent groups sort of develop. And one is when you get to around 10 to 15 people per acre, which is like a roughly 4 to 8 housing units per acre, if there's roughly like 2.5 people per house, which is the case in Greater Boston. And that's when you start to get like, oh, more frequent bus service or 30-minute intervals for trains, and kind of just like a moderate level of transit service is kind of considered viable. And then there's another one of between 30 and 45 people per acre, around like 15, 16 housing units per acre, which is when you can talk more about, frequent bus service and rapid transit and, regional rail or frequent rail service. And so we just wanted to kind of do those in order to have these like benchmarks in order to assess Greater Boston and how our density levels are in the region. And so we ended up kind of settling on those. The kind of 15, 16 units per acre is going to be obviously very familiar with the MBTA communities conversation. But the lower benchmark we thought was also good to establish, just because honestly, very few stations in our region reach the 15, 16 unit per acre benchmark. So we want to at least, set a lower bar just to be like, hey, if we could, reach this bar, we'd be making real progress. And so I'll just go through a little bit, a few of those benchmarks and kind of looking at our region at a macro level. So the average density within a half mile, we chose a half mile. It's kind of well used. Honestly, there probably are better ways to do this, but we ended up sticking to the kind of the half mile radius for sort of, I guess, simplicity's sake in some ways. But it does tend to correspond to like a 10 to 15-minute walk. So it's not perfect, but it's okay for at least macro analysis. But so the average density for MBTA rapid transit was 11.8 units per acre. The bus network averaged 3.3, commuter rail 3.2, and then we also looked at regional transit authorities. They averaged 1.8 units per acre within a half mile of a stop. And so obviously you can see there just kind of, high level density levels are fairly low. Obviously, rapid transit network has the highest level of density, but even then there's room for improvement, to say the least. And so, for example, just looking at the the red, orange, blue, green, and silver lines, which stations have, or how many stations reach that 16 units per acre, for example. And you can see that's like really only about half in most cases, and with a few. And in many cases, actually less than half. And so, for example, like the red line is only 5 stations that have that density. Obviously, because the red line kind of has a different pattern in which it like carves through Boston than like the orange line, for example. But still, only 5 station areas. And to be fair, this data does not like there's it's imperfect. We calculated in Todex, and we tried to like figure out new developments and stuff like that, but you can't quite always get them. And so, for example, like Alewife does not reach the 16 units per acre, which I'm pretty sure it does at this point with the recent development there. Also, like student populations tend to be lacking. So, like at Harvard Square, I think is a little bit below the 16 units per acre, which I'm sure if you counted, dorms and then you'd reach those metrics. But so in general, I mean, people can look more closely in the report at these figures. But we wanted to kind of map out those density levels. You can also look at Todex itself and look even more detail and add specific stations. I will say the one thing I do want to kind of highlight here is like you can kind of see the tail ends, how they do die down. You can see that on the orange line. You can see that on the blue line, and then even the green line as well. And I think the green line, the one thing that really stands out is the D branch of the green line, the Riverside branch, which has actually pretty incredibly low densities compared to the rest of the green line, despite being, I think, honestly one of the better branches. And this is kind of just set that stage a little bit. I'm doing on time. I'm doing fine. We also in the report we want to look at commuter rail. Obviously, a lot of conversation around commuter rail these days. And I mean, really, the upshot is that there's a reason why we look at commuter rail, and there's a reason why things like MBTA communities have focused on commuter rail, because it's frankly impressive how low density levels tend to be in a commuter rail. For example, there's only 6 station areas that have commuter rail station areas that have a density of at least 6 units per acre. And only one of those is actually just a commuter rail station, meaning that's not like, Porter Square also has the red line, for example. And I mean, I don't know, people speculate in your head what that station area might be, but the only one is Lansdowne that reaches that 16 units per acre. And actually, I mean, I think it's 102 of the 134 commuter rail stations don't even reach 6 units per acre, which is, hardly, I mean, in the report, we include a map that shows the entire density levels for the entire region. You can see that 6 units per acre is like a inner core suburb. It's a fairly suburban level of density, and very few commuter rail stations even reach that level of density. As many of them are actually below 2 or 1 units per acre. Um, but we also, I mean, obviously the commuter rail is vast. It's lots of stations. It covers a lot of geographies. It goes through a lot of environments. And so like, what can be really like, is there something interesting or like worth parsing out? And we figured, I mean, one thing that we can talk about is, if it's supposed to be a commuter rail, obviously it'd be, better if it was a more frequent, if it was a regional rail, or, we have bigger ambitions for what it could be. But even as a commuter rail, if you're trying to commute into Boston, say stations within 30 minutes of Boston, so within 30 minutes of North or South Station, what are density levels like along those lines? And we were looking at all of them and just kind of found a regular pattern that like even within 30 minutes of Boston, you'd get a very large drop off in density fairly quickly. And so, for example, this is the Worcester line. And after you leave the city of Boston, so after Boston Landing, none of the station areas within 30 minutes of Boston reached even the 6 units per acre benchmark. And so this is just kind of, quantifying that, people might be individually familiar with these areas and each one kind of has a different context and different story behind it. But when you compare that to other cities, other regions, it's I don't know what the best way to phrase it is, but it's inefficient at the least, I suppose, and definitely just kind of on a broader level shows that we have a lot of progress we could make, which is kind of my framing around this report at least. And so on the flip side of that, we want to talk a little bit about the state of, flipping the terms, so the state of density supportive transit in Greater Boston. So kind of talking about what does transit need to do in order to support higher levels of density. And this was obviously a part that we leaned very heavily on Transit Matters expertise. And honestly, I think here, once I wrap up this presentation, it'd be really great to hear your thoughts on this. Because I'm again not a transit expert, and I'm still feel like I can explain the kind of the housing component of this conversation very well, but there's still like what can get transit there is still an area that I'm learning about. And so I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts here. The one thing we did talk about in the report is the importance of obviously of service frequency. So the folks at Transit Matters led a lot of this research, but discussing the bus network redesign and increasing the number of bus routes that provide 15-minute service and frequencies. Obviously the promotion of regional rails and other means to do that. Obviously most of our rapid transit lines have reached those levels of frequency, but even then our rapid transit lines tend to have lower levels of frequency than other rapid transit services in the country and obviously throughout the world. And so that's kind of the first step, obviously, towards being able to support higher levels of density and higher levels of ridership. We briefly introduced other things like speed and accessibility, and there are other components as well. But and then obviously, when you talk about frequency, the one thing that really stands out is the commuter rails frequency levels. If you're aiming for 30-minute frequencies, only 3 of the lines have a peak frequency of at least 30 minutes. Several of the lines have a peak frequency, meaning rush hour on a weekday. That's just still above 60 minutes. And then there's various, you can look here for yourselves, but various other lines still also tend to average above 45-minute frequencies. And that's obviously kind of well beyond I think a lot of people in this group will know that, but like well beyond what someone can really use on a day-to-day basis to commute regularly, because if you have any emergency or any reason that you need to catch a train quickly, you rely on a schedule that can be very difficult to plan around and coordinate. And so that's kind of one of the main limitations of encouraging these higher levels of density. And so in the end, what we end up having is this, the system that we are making some progress in housing construction and making some progress in frequency. But the fact of the matter is we still have a very long way to go. And it's almost a bit of a chicken and the egg in some ways where, we need the density in order to support the ridership, but we need the frequency of service in order to support the density. And I mean, that might not be groundbreaking to everyone, but we feel like that framing is at least useful for people. Just to kind of wrap things up, or at least bring up a few specific case studies for people. In our report, we talk through I mean, at one point we were talking through like 10 station areas, and then we kind of realized we need to make this a little more digestible for people. And so we just kind of wanted to talk through a few different areas that were like, okay, this is the type of station that could really in the long run should be seeing higher levels of density. It's been making progress, but there's still a lot of barriers in the way. And so one of those are like urban areas with really rich transit, just urban kind of hubs in some way, but just kind of relatively low levels of density. I just want to pull up the figures here so that I'm speaking correctly. But so like Forest Hills is a great example where, obviously it has 3 commuter rail lines being serviced. It has Orange Line service. And it has, I think, several dozen bus line services, including a few frequent bus services. Yet, just because of its kind of historical development pattern, doesn't have or has a lot of neighborhoods around it that are very low density. They're historic, they're beautiful neighborhoods in many respects. But that is a kind of a conflict with the kind of a potential capacity of Forest Hills to really kind of, I mean, for a lot of reasons, be able to carry a lot of passengers and do a lot of play a big role in our region versus its kind of current role. And so while there has been some new development in the region, and we talk a little bit about that in the report as well, and there has been more than 600 units of housing, for example, produced in Forest Hills in recent years. It still only averages 11.8 units per acre of density. And so further amount of service that it provides, instead of treating it as a transit hub, it can really just become like a hub of the city itself in a lot of respects. Needham is another example where there's a lot of kind of transit challenges around the capacity of the commuter rail. It's one of the least frequent commuter rail services. But it also really stands out for the very, very low levels of residential density in Needham Center, as well as just kind of in the report, we talk about some specific, like large parcels that have been abandoned for a while and kind of some of the challenges around embracing the MBTA communities law in Needham. And just for being such an inner core neighborhood in many respects, the kind of the transit service that it's provided with and the residential density that it has are both just a bit poor, I suppose one could say. And so in the report we talk about that a little bit more, but I'm not an expert in Needham, so I don't want to overstate things. I'm assuming someone else in the audience will know more than I do. And then the third type of community that we just wanted to flag, where I mean, in general, these are kind of the gateway cities, I suppose is the one way to phrase that, but are these kind of regional urban centers with kind of, I mean, lower housing demand is one way to put it, but also just kind of a lot of parcel potential. A lot of I mean, one thing we looked at was the residential, the tax database, and it kind of identified developable parcels that were in each station area. And so Brockton really stood out as having a lot of developable parcels. And there have been a few projects that have come online in Brockton lately. However, there's still a lot of potential there. And these places also kind of, ties into broader conversations around regional transit authorities and increasing funding and capacity for them and kind of relieving pressure on Boston in a lot of ways. But yeah, I don't want to, like I said, I want to be brief because I know there's a lot of really smart people in this room as well. And I wanted to give people a chance to, ask me questions, but also to talk amongst yourselves. And yeah, I hope, I mean, this report was intended for a kind of a broader audience and a less technically expertise audience. So I'm curious people's thoughts in general. And yeah, well, thank you, Abby, for having me.
Yeah, no, thank you. Even though I have read through most of the report, maybe not word for word, but this was definitely very helpful to put a lot of things into context. I especially liked hearing about why you guys chose the metrics that you chose and why you chose the case studies that you chose. Yeah, I would love to open it up to questions, discussion. Yeah, Susan.
So I feel like I'm always the first one to jump right in,
No,
but
it's great.
I love these discussions. So thank you so much for always bringing interesting topics here. Lucas, thank you for your work on this. There's a few things that I have a lot of thoughts about this. First off, I think the overall point of your research was just, hey, where there's transit-rich environments, why don't we add more housing there? That would just make more sense, right? And that I don't think most people could disagree with that. Of course, once you get down to the level of actually making that happen, you end up with a whole variety of challenges. But that premise there, it makes sense. If you've got good transit, build some housing around it. Let's take more advantage of it. Let's get the ridership. But we also have this challenge of how do we connect people to transit? Right? Like if you look at the town I'm in, so I'm in here in Lexington, we are surrounded by train stations, train communities, commuter rail communities. We have no way to get people there other than just driving there. Okay. And right now, even if money were to fall from the sky, land in my lap, and I could extend a bus to whichever one of those towns I wanted, let's say Burlington, or I'm not Burlington, the Woburn Transit Center, or to Winchester, Belmont, wherever, um, the trains are so infrequent that that's certainly not going to be the highest priority, for bus service is going to a train, because then you end up spending a lot of time idling there just to get people, back and forth between the two. So this chicken and egg thing is very real. And it's a problem we have to figure out how to solve, because as many of you have heard, Lexington was the first community to have our zoning approved. We've had a number of applications come in, some of which have already been approved, one building permit already issued. And, people are concerned, where's all the traffic going to go, because we don't have much bus service at all. And it's tough. I hate even having to say that, because personally, I'd love to see more housing. It's desperately needed. It's something the town wanted even before this MBTA Communities Act came up. But it's a very real thing that not only do we have like half as much bus service as we had 4 decades ago, but then we also saw cuts since COVID that haven't come back, and developers are building housing with more parking than we would really like to see. And once it's built, you can't unbuild it. It's kind of hard to unbuild it, right? So people are going to come with their cars. So I'm asking not just you, Lucas, but I think this whole group and any transit advocate, please, can we somehow find a way to build a visionary plan, a well-networked, well-integrated transit plan? And there doesn't seem to be any entity that does that. I was on an MBTA advisory board meeting today, and then had a follow-up email with folks on that. Like, nobody's doing it. I noticed even in our non-discrimination statement that opened up this meeting, it said, we all have the right to participate in a transportation planning process. That's great, but where's this transit planning happening? It doesn't seem to be happening. I know we have the program for mass transit coming up, but that sounds like that's still going to be, almost 2 years from now before maybe there's a completed plan. And I think we have to give the public, developers, people that live in these communities, a real vision, a real plan for what a better network could be. Because again, not all of us are going to have rail. So that's one thing. Sorry, a whole thing there. And then my other thing is, when I looked at the data, I actually did a spreadsheet using your metrics. And if Abby wants me to share it, I can pull it up on the screen. But according to the metrics that you had in your slide, and I did want to find out more about this, Lexington at the moment would not qualify for any transit whatsoever. And even if we doubled our population, we wouldn't even qualify for anything more than very infrequent transit. Additionally, Somerville doesn't even qualify for light rail according to your metrics, and Cambridge, and I don't know, there are a whole bunch of things. Arlington, I know, would only qualify for hourly bus service at best. I could show you my spreadsheet, but I was curious about this because, a lot of times, of course, you hear pushback. Well, those of us in this room probably really want to see better transit. We know how important it is to meet so many goals. There's of course people that don't want to see more transit, and it feels like some of the metrics that were used give them help them with that argument instead of helping people that want to see better transit. So if there's time, I can quickly pull up the spreadsheet I did, but I'd love to understand like how we ended up with metrics that say that even Somerville and Cambridge and Arlington don't deserve really great transit. Thank you.
Yeah, I would love to hear other people's thoughts on the rest of that, because that was all really wonderful. I just want to touch that one like methodology thing at the end there, because I think one part of that then is that I only got to touch on it briefly, but the scale at which you're measuring density matters a lot, right? If you're saying like Cambridge, what is Cambridge's level of density? Then that's incorporating a lot of stuff, including a lot of, non-residential parcels, and it's a very complicated equation. And so I guess I don't think I flagged it very well in my presentation, but like, so like those metrics then are for when you're considering like a half-mile radius, right? And and specifically also looking at residential density versus, tying in employment density. And there's kind of a lot of components to that. And so, if you use the residency tool, for example, and draw a half-mile acre around whatever the Union Square's new station in Somerville, the I don't know if the density level is there, but it's I think it's well above 16 units per acre. And then because you get into more whatever, it gets about gross acreage or gross densities versus net densities. And so are you including non-residential parcels? And so parks and civic services and stuff like that, or are you just looking only at what is the density of the residential properties within the geography? And so again, so those things end up kind of like, it's tough. Yeah, I would be terrified to go into like a court battle or something and be like, that's the number, and I'm gonna justify that one. But yeah, it's hard you're comparing apples to oranges at a certain point as well. And so hopefully this just kind of give people a rough sense, but there's no one perfect way, I suppose, to measure density at any scale.
Yeah, and that's something that I was also thinking about, like in terms of, like, of course, these things should be developed simultaneously, but they're not likely going to be. Like, if you develop the density first, you develop like one parcel that is like super dense, like 400 housing units over 8 acres or something like that. But then if that's the only parcel for like a surrounding like 5 mile radius in some of these more like slightly more west or north, like a little bit more rural towns, it's like that also changes the equation of things, because yeah, then it is above the threshold for like relatively infrequent bus service or something, but it's like that one area probably won't be enough to support in like transit over time, or I don't know. Anyways, John.
Thanks, Abby. Yeah, that's a very good question about the density, because that also ties into the randomness. In the older days, when commuting was just developed after World War II, people went from a place to a place, and they all lived in the community. They all kind of worked at the same factory, or they all kind of went into Boston to work in an office. And today, you find so much randomness. You could have a high-rise apartment building which would qualify for transit, except you would have to have 20 destinations for this transit operation to go to and come back from on a regular basis. So this is one of the things that we find here in Burlington, because our population, which is around 30,000, swells to over 100,000 when everybody comes into the office. So our connections to different areas are going to vary during the day. Our connections up north, so it's a multidimensional problem, and it's very interesting. I like the idea about the density of what it can actually support, because again, then you do have to pay, you have to schedule the drivers, you have to do all the practical things, and this is the kind of metric that you need to make something actually work, instead of just being an idea or a thought.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to what Susan was saying and what like all of us have been saying about just the networking needs, not necessarily like a hub and spoke model in and out of downtown Boston that we've been relying on forever and ever, but that we do have these gateways. I know Burlington's not a gateway city, but like high employment centers outside of the inner core that don't have these types of like radiating transit systems, and how stressful that can be for like the transportation system writ large. David.
Yes. So I agree with Susan, what Susan said. I usually do, and others. So Lucas, in your report, I was just thinking about Jersey City, and I was thinking about Arlington in particular. Individual cities within a larger region, right, that happen to have really good transit frequency and reasonable fare to get into Manhattan or into DC. And maybe it's the most similar, I think, to Cambridge in our region, where they have really great Red Line service and Bleachmere and a reasonable fare to get on at those stops. And that's where we've seen so much development, right? In Kendall and Leechmere and, different places in Cambridge. And I'm the most familiar with Newton, of course. I wonder if we're living in sort of a different place here. We're definitely building more housing for sure. People want to live here. And we do have a good Green Line service. And we have some bus service. And like you mentioned, we have some commuter rail service, but it doesn't stop for big gaps during the day. It's not usable, even though, we do have service, and it's expensive, the price, right? And we have the express bus, which is expensive to get on and being cut back. So, even though housing is being built, I just feel like maybe it's harder to depend on transit or to afford it, maybe. So what do? I guess just keep on working to build more housing and keep working to improve, transit, all the different modes of transit. I guess that's where we're at.
Yeah, I'll just echo that, I guess, because sorry, I completely agree with that. And the other part that this always kind of reminds me of is like, we're stuck having these housing conversations because we kind of have to, because it's been such a long, slow process, and we have been building more housing lately. But the other component of that too is then that is building other amenities or civic institutions, or more placemaking around some of these transit nodes as well, so that it's not that hub and spoke model, because we don't live in an era in which everyone is commuting every day into downtown Boston, and thank goodness, because that's an incredibly inefficient way to build a transit system. And so kind of a lot of this conversation ends up focusing on the housing space as it needs to, but I think maybe you guys will agree more in that sense, but when you start to think more about from the transit perspective, then it starts becoming more of a question of placemaking and kind of unlocking other uses in these areas, and so that people are moving in different directions, and you're not having these ghost trains going one way and very crowded trains going another way. But
Yeah, I think that's something that I was also thinking of when I was like looking through the report, is the idea, and this is again ties back to like the networking, more like centralized effort points, that like we are obviously like a regional agency, but we're not like a regional government. Like we don't have a lot of sticks and carrots necessarily. But so I was wondering if like when you guys were researching the case studies, if you did come across like any sort of regional governance initiatives. I know obviously like counties are a lot more powerful in other areas, or I don't really know how they're set up in Canada, but I assume there's something akin to counties. Like something that's larger than a city but smaller than a state. And if you ran into like, I guess I'm just wondering, like, did you run into that when you were researching?
yeah, it's a good question, and I'm curious if other people here maybe know more, because honestly, I didn't like particularly. I think the New Jersey Transit Village is kind of an interesting thing, but that's at the state level, and so I'm sure other people can speak to that model. The only other model I can really speak of is I know I lived in Italy for a handful of years. I know kind of the Milan has a very strong regional government, and they do a lot of the transportation work there, and it is. They're able to be a lot more effective in a lot more ways because of that. They can switch the type of train service. They can do a lot. They can be a lot more ambitious in terms of their transit goals, and be a lot better at connecting different types of transit. But that's it's hard to replicate some of it's just some fundamental basics in governance that's different between us and a lot of European countries. But yeah, I'll open the floor to anyone else who and has their expertise.
Yeah, Susan.
Try to be brief. Yeah, so I had mentioned in the chat a book that I really appreciate. It's called Transport for Suburbia, Beyond the Automobile Age by Paul Meese. It was written in, I think, around 2010, so it could certainly use some updates. But he does talk about Toronto and Vancouver. The main line, I want anyone to be worried about this, uses this phrase, density is not destiny. It doesn't mean that he was against density. He was just saying that, like, there are places that are not dense at this point in time. and how can you better connect those places, right? And so, and he points to a variety of communities, around the world. And what he found was that when there was a centralized approach to planning, that's how you got a better network that worked for people. Because we're going to have densities of varying types, right? And people everywhere need to get around, So no matter how many increases in density we get, how much more housing we get, we're still always going to have that challenge of how do you help people in places that are less dense. So, and it's through this network effect, but you have to have a strong central planning to that. And what I found was most interesting, I just reread it again recently. And one of the things I thought was fascinating was like, he even discovered that in some places, it didn't really matter if all the transit was provided in-house. It could be done either way. It could be provided all in-house. Let's say it's MBTA, everything in the MBTA area provided by the MBTA, or it could be, some of it outsourced or a combo. But as long as you had that central planning, that made a difference. And one of the things I've been frustrated with here, some as you may know, is how we have just so many different operators kind of doing their own thing, and we don't have any real planning and a real integrated network. And I would really love to see that change. So.
Yeah, Elena. Also, just to introduce Elena, for those of you who maybe haven't joined an MPO meeting lately, Elena is our new manager of MPO planning and policy. She is wonderful. She's been here for about a month, and she's my manager.
Thank you, Abby. Hi, everyone. I'm Elena Ion, and thanks so much, Lucas, for a great presentation. I wanted to go back to a point you made about station areas that are rich with density, but that are underserved by transit versus other areas with low housing demand, even though they have robust transit. And I think this is an important question to take into account. Going back to Susan's point about creating a coordinated plan that takes into account all of these dimensions, housing, land use patterns, transportation, transit. One of the things that we try to think of at the MPO is creating this type of coordinated plan where we take into account not only the tools, but the state of the market, especially in these areas where there is not a strong housing market. The Brockton example was, I think, a great example, is some of these zoning tools are not effective. So 40B is not effective. MBTA communities, there's so many barriers and issues with development feasibility that I think only this type of regional coordinated plan, as Susan mentioned, could take into account all these variables. And we could start thinking of how to use transit to unlock these areas that currently have low demand. But I think one question that we've tried to think through is the difficulty of doing land value capture in these areas with low demand. Because if, you can do this in Boston, it's much more difficult to do this in Brockton, for example, so that you can start supporting and subsidizing transit or last mile connections. So again, I just wanted to nod to Susan's point about the need for a plan where all the agencies come together and coordinate.
Yeah, and I think to kind of jump off of that, so obviously in like the very, very nascent stages, but we are starting like at the MPO to think about like how can we be helpful in some sort of like larger coordinated effort to like coordinate where people live and where they want to go. And so kind of on that note, like I would be interested to see if any of the like municipal staff in this call have thoughts on the types of things that like might be helpful in that, or what you would really want to see, or what you think would be totally useless. Any thoughts at all? I know that's like such a vague question, but it's a very vague undertaking at this point. So
I sort of feel like other people should talk. I know there's other municipal people here, but I don't see any hands. So,
Take it away.
yeah, well, I can't remember how long ago it was, but remember you brought Jonathan Church here to this transit working group a while ago, and he was talking about the planning he was doing at the MassDOT level, right? To really map out all the services that exist. So all the fixed route services, granted this is at the state level, but all the fixed route services and all the demand responsive services. And then that would show us where do we have overlaps, where do we have duplication, where do we have gaps, where do we have near misses where things could connect but they just don't. Seems to me like that's something I've been wanting to see for a very long time, and I think that would help us in planning a better network, but then we'd also have to understand with it what are the frequencies of things. So that's something I would love to see. And then from there, I think once we kind of have that data before us, that can help us to work towards a real regional plan. And we can kind of, figure out who operates whatever, but let's figure out a plan first, if that makes sense. And, funding obviously comes later, but we really need that data, I think.
100%. Yeah. Len.
I find that staff tends to just not have capacity, and it's hard to bring something new to them, and expect them to have the time to do it. You have to kind of plan for them to work on these kinds of initiatives, that bring planners together, because I don't think we're going to get some kind of regional planning agency beyond what we have with MAPC, but we're not going to have any kind of county form of like real governance here, so we're going to have to put it together ourselves, and so I would encourage the MPO when it does its sub-region meetings, to talk with the planners that are there and figure out how the sub-regions can coordinate amongst themselves, and then how we can bring those sub-regions together. It'll take some time and a lot of effort, but I think rather than saying we need some region-wide planning agency that has real enforcement, for lack of a better word, we have what we have, and let's try to piece it together as best as we can. It's suboptimal, but I think we can make some progress. And when it comes to bus service, especially with Lexington, I think we could have conversations with the T, that could get more bus service, to Lexington, especially along the 77, because there were some thoughts about doing that with the bus redesign, so it'd be great to maybe have conversations with someone like Melissa DeLay to see what we could do in terms of planning to have more bus service, even if not within the next year or two. If we see more housing coming online in Lexington, then the T can maybe plan to provide additional service. And that Lexington would just be an example of that. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah, definitely. And that's something that I've been thinking a lot about. Well, not just me, everybody everywhere has been thinking about it, is like as MBTA communities does create more density or just more housing writ large in places, like the sort of anticipatory planning processes that could create. Like we know where these like new zoning districts are, so we can kind of anticipate where new housing is going to be created. And like, is there a way that we can do some sort of like anticipated planning efforts so that when the new housing does come online, it's like easier for us to move towards serving those transportation needs?
And if I could just add quickly, I think with the Millionaires Tax, which has money devoted towards transportation and education, we could maybe get the money from there, to say, look, this is what we want to do, and it meshes with the MBTA community. So I think our leaders, are up to the task. We just need to present them with the ideas. So that's it. Thank you.
Yeah, Andrew.
Yes, thank you. I arrived late, so this comment may be a little bit misplaced. But on terms of staff capacity, I'm wondering if we really have clear boundaries as to who is doing what. when you look at, for example, the way that transit planning is done in Zurich, where you have the overriding regional body setting standards, and within those standards, the local planners actually and agencies plan the service. That kind of process really frees up things, and the regional planning isn't getting down into the specific details, and the local people don't have to worry about what's the appropriate level. So I think we need to look at roles a bit here too, so we're not duplicating stuff between individual towns where it's appropriate to be done in a regional basis and vice versa. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's dead on. John.
Okay, good. I always have a hard time getting that microphone going. Sorry, I had a question for Lucas about the density with the survey. Do you have any statistics from Europe? Are they where their transit is? Are they more in that 16 units per acre scenario, or how do they stand?
From where? Sorry, from Europe? Was that what you asked?
As Andrew was just mentioning, Zurich. So
Yeah.
Zurich, Paris, in Germany, England, are
Yeah.
those areas more geared towards that 16 unit per acre scenario that supports a rich transit density program, or?
Yeah, I mean, obviously every country, and every city has its own, there's a lot of complications. The only one I can speak to personally is Milan, because I worked on a density report there as well when I was doing my master's there. And for literally like there's a, I don't know, 30 or 40 square mile, like 100 square kilometer area in the core of Milan where almost everywhere is well above. I mean, again, we don't use units per acre there, but the density levels are quite high. And you do kind of have that. It's a different relationship. It's a different, development pattern and all that. But it kind of has that 5/1, or really just mainly just 5. It's not most apartment buildings don't have commercial on the first floor, but the kind of the vastness of it, or the consistency of it, which does allow so many different transit modes and so many kind of different types of service. And Milan has so many problems with over car reliance in such a dense area, and they're dealing with their own challenges there. But it's sometimes hard to compare with European cities or stations, just because the development pattern is so different, and they're just so much more advanced that it's hard to imagine how you get from here to there, or even whether or not you always want to get from here to there. And so that's why we try to stick to North American examples for this, just to make it at least digestible, or like there's policy takeaways you can make. But at least, I mean, obviously other people have different experiences, but in my experience, they're well above 16 units per acre in most urban environments.
Sure. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And the other question I had about that, are there, when you were doing your study, were there destinations as randomized as we have it here in the United States, or were they basically going to within that 100-kilometer circle that you were talking about? In other words, were there people going north and south and east and west and all different places to get to their offices and factories and so forth, or did they come from one area and go to another area, or was there an industrial area that everybody went to, or how was the development pattern over there?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, again, I can only speak to Milan specifically, but Milan's obviously, it was a very industrial city, and so it does have it has one thing that it does have is it has a lot of very large industrial spaces, kind of in like a Detroit or something like that, where they've been able to repurpose them, and so they've actually done a lot of cool kind of housing developments around these very large industrial spaces that used to have former car factories and stuff like that. And the combination of that is that inherently those things are always along train corridors, because that's as factories would need to send out their production, and so that's like created this inherently really rich TOD oriented development that they've been able to pursue lately. And so one of the challenges I think for Boston is that that's not really our heritage in a lot of ways. We don't have those, there's not that many like Cambridge crossings or these type of spaces that have that rich transit connection and large quantities of available space. And so I think just the big question has been, yeah, we don't have these levels of densities in a lot of spaces, but where can you do that in a way where our development patterns have kind of allowed for this fairly low level of density to be in really what turns out to be very valuable, pieces of land, frankly, to put it kind of bluntly, these areas of Brookline and Cambridge and whatnot that are very close to their core. And that's something that personally I don't see in very many, my time in Milan and Berlin and Paris and those type of places where you have these places close to the center that have been able to have a different kind of land use and have been able to be, maintain their kind of low levels of zoning. And you don't have those relationships. And so I think those are the kind of the challenges that we have, but.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. That's what I was curious, because a lot of times we see these things held up as examples. And then that's a very, very key metric that you brought up this afternoon rather, about the population density. Can it support a transit system? And again, when you combine it with we don't have, as the old MBTA boss used to say, the MBTA is about commuting, not transit. Transit is, as Susan says, it's a network between communities. Two totally different concepts and two totally kind of plans. And one of the things that we don't really know in all the talking and all the different meetings I've been to, we really don't know where people who are living in a place go to work, or where people who are working in a place live. So we really, without that, how do you make any kind of plan? Because one person goes here, another person goes there. How do you coordinate things? So that was very, very helpful. I like that density idea. Thanks.
Yep.
Well, if one of the things, about network planning that is really helpful is you have to plan for transfers, right? And making it so that transfers are really convenient. Then people can get pretty much anywhere, right? So you have to develop a system that is well networked, where transfers are easy to do. They're affordable, but really easy to kind of make that connection. And because we're always going to have people that need to go a variety of places. So anyways, I can't recommend that book, Transport for Suburbia, enough. I'm broken record here at this point, but it's really worth looking into. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thank you guys. Thanks everybody. This has been a very fruitful conversation, in my opinion. And I do want to be respectful of people's times. I know we've gone a little bit over, but this has been a very good conversation. So I personally am fine with that. But if we want to move on to members' items, and then we can close out. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, the slides are very similar, but thank you for moving the slide. Yeah, so members' items. Are there any updates on municipal projects, any grant awards or applications people want to share? I guess that one should probably be a little revised in the current federal climate. Or events coming up, just basically anything that people want other people to know about in their municipality / service area. Speak now or forever hold your peace until 3 months from now.
Oh, sure. I
Sorry,
was hoping people would get sick of me. Well, I'll do some bad news. We're getting less money from the state for transit in Lexington. So I've got to fill a hole of $125,000. So if anyone knows where I can get funding for transit, I'd appreciate it, because the last thing I want to do is cut our transit services even more. And then on a completely different note, we are hosting, it won't be about the book I've been talking about today, Transport for Suburbia, but we are having a book discussion, a community reads on a really great book called When Driving is Not an Option. It's by Anna Zivarts, Zivarts. We're going to do that on May 29th. And maybe what I can do is put something out there, maybe email it to you, Abby, and you're welcome to share that, because we'd love for anyone to join us in discussing the book, but also the author is going to join us via Zoom that evening. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, 100%. I'll include that in the follow-up email. Alrighty. Well, thank you, everybody. This has been an excellent meeting. I will again reach out in the coming days with a follow-up email with a link to the recording of this, a link to the report, a link to Susan's quasi book club. And we will see you in a couple of months. Thanks. Oh, and thank you, Lucas, for taking the time to present the report to us. This has been very helpful.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me. Thank you, Abby. Take care, everybody.
Thanks, Lucas. Thanks, Abby.
Bye, everyone.